Your body has been keeping a secret, not a small one. If you are between 60 and 70 years old and you can still achieve a full, reliable erection without medication, no pill on the nightstand, no timing a window, no negotiating with your own body before you can be present with someone you love, you are not experiencing something normal. You are experiencing something rare. And I don't mean rare the way doctors use that word to describe 1 in a million conditions. I mean rare in the statistical, measurable, documented sense. The data on male sexual function in this decade is clear, and almost nobody frames it with the honesty it deserves. A growing majority of men between 60 and 70 have lost something, not all at once, quietly, gradually. 1 year the function was reliable. The next it was mostly reliable, then occasionally unreliable, then something that required planning, medication, or simply a quiet decision to stop expecting what used to come naturally. Most of those men were told, or told themselves, the same thing, that it was just age, that it was inevitable, that the body simply changes, and there's a point where you accept what it can no longer do. That is not the whole story. And the part that's missing, the part that almost never makes it into a 15-minute appointment, is the part that actually matters. Because what is happening inside the body of a man who loses erectile function in his 60s is not primarily a story about aging. It is a story about a specific biological system that has been quietly declining for years before the first obvious symptom appeared. And what is happening inside the body of a man who still has full function at 65, 68, 70, without anything pharmaceutical keeping it there, is not luck. It is a system that is still working. The question worth asking is why. Drop a comment right now with your city and where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you're comfortable sharing it, let me know where you currently stand. Fully functional, partially, or somewhere in between. No judgment here. This is exactly the conversation most men never get to have with someone who will actually answer them honestly. My name is Dr. David Chen. I specialize in men's health and healthy aging, and I've spent years working specifically with men in this age bracket, the 60s and 70s, the decade where this conversation becomes unavoidable, whether a man is ready for it or not. I want to tell you something I don't usually lead with. I've sat across from men who are embarrassed to be in that chair. Successful men, strong men, men who coached their kids' little league, who built companies, who spent 40 years being the person other people leaned on, sitting in my office and not quite making eye contact when they describe what's been happening. And I've thought, more than once, nobody prepared these men for this conversation. Not their fathers, not their doctors, not anyone. This video is my attempt to be that someone. What I've noticed consistently across patients is that the men who still have reliable function without medication are not simply men who take care of themselves in the broad, generic sense that phrase usually means. They are not necessarily the ones who exercise the most, or eat the cleanest diet, or have the lowest stress. They share something more specific than that, something that has a name, a measurable biological basis, and critically, inputs that can be influenced. And the men who are losing function are losing it for reasons that almost nobody has taken the time to explain to them in plain language. That changes today. Here is what I want you to understand before anything else, because it reframes everything that follows. An erection is not primarily a sexual event. I know that sounds strange, but stay with me because this single reframe is the most useful thing I can offer you in the next 25 minutes. An erection is a vascular event. It is a hydraulic event. It is the result of a cascade of signals that begins in the nervous system, travels through the endocrine system, and culminates in a very specific and demanding test of your blood vessels' ability to dilate rapidly, fill tissue with blood, and maintain pressure. That is not a simple thing. It requires multiple systems to be working in coordination, and it requires one particular biological mechanism to be functioning with a level of precision that, as it turns out, reflects the health of your entire cardiovascular system. So what is the mechanism? The answer is one word that most people have heard, but few actually understand: endothelium. The endothelium is the thin layer of cells lining the inside of every blood vessel in your body. Every artery, every vein, every capillary, all of them coated on the inside by this single layer of cells that is, despite its apparent simplicity, one of the most metabolically active tissues in the human body. The endothelium is not passive. It does not simply sit there while blood flows past. It monitors. It responds. It produces signaling molecules that tell the smooth muscles surrounding each vessel whether to contract or relax, whether the vessel narrows or widens, whether blood flows freely or meets resistance. The most important of those signaling molecules is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the molecule that makes an erection possible. When sexual arousal signals arrive, the endothelium releases nitric oxide into the surrounding smooth muscle tissue. Nitric oxide causes that muscle to relax. The arterial walls expand. Blood rushes into the erectile tissue, the corpus cavernosum, at a rate and pressure that compresses the veins responsible for drainage, trapping blood inside and creating the rigidity of a full erection. That entire sequence depends on the endothelium producing enough nitric oxide quickly enough in response to the right signals. When endothelial function is healthy, when those cells are responsive, when the nitric oxide signal is strong and fast, the system works exactly as designed. When endothelial function is compromised, when the cells are inflamed, when oxidative stress has damaged their signaling machinery, when years of metabolic insult have reduced their ability to produce nitric oxide efficiently, the signal weakens. The vessels don't dilate fully. Blood flow into erectile tissue is reduced. The hydraulic event is incomplete. Think of it as a network of pipes controlled by pressure valves. The valves are opened by a signal, nitric oxide. In a well-functioning system, the signal is strong. The valves open completely. Pressure builds exactly where it needs to build. Now imagine that the mechanism controlling those valves has been slowly corroding. Not dramatically, not all at once, but year by year, quietly degrading. The valves still open. Sometimes all the way, sometimes most of the way, sometimes just enough, and sometimes not quite enough. That corrosion is endothelial dysfunction, and it begins years, often a decade or more, before the first time a valve fails to open at all. Okay, sit with this for a second. Endothelial dysfunction in the penile arteries, the small vessels that supply erectile tissue, typically precedes endothelial dysfunction in the coronary arteries by 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. Which means that a man whose erectile function is beginning to change is not simply experiencing a sexual health issue. He is experiencing an early warning that his vascular system, the entire system, not just one part of it, is beginning to lose efficiency. The penile arteries are showing the signal first because they are smaller, because they are more sensitive to vascular compromise, because they respond to endothelial changes before the larger vessels do. The body is not failing randomly. It is sending the earliest available signal through the most sensitive available channel. Most men silence that signal with a pill and move on. I understand why. The pill works. The immediate problem is solved. Nobody wants to sit in that discomfort longer than necessary. And I won't pretend I wouldn't reach for the same thing if I were in that position. The path of least resistance is human, and there's no shame in it. But the underlying process, the endothelial dysfunction driving the change, continues. And 3 to 5 years later, it shows up somewhere else. In a stress test, in a calcium score, in a conversation nobody wants to have. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you this because the man who understands this in his 60s, who reads the signal correctly instead of silencing it, has a window of intervention that is genuinely powerful. The endothelium is not static tissue. It responds to inputs. It can improve. The research on endothelial recovery in older adults is not a footnote. It is one of the more compelling areas of vascular medicine, precisely because the tissue is responsive at an age when most people assume the biology is fixed. But you have to know what you're working with. There are beliefs that men carry into their 60s about this subject that are costing them years of function they didn't have to lose. I see the consequences of those beliefs every week. and I want to go through them honestly, because some of them sound so reasonable that I held versions of them myself before the data changed my mind. The first one. Most men assume that erectile dysfunction is primarily a testosterone problem. It makes intuitive sense. Testosterone declines with age. Sexual function declines with age. The correlation seems obvious. And testosterone absolutely plays a role. Declining testosterone in this decade is real. It affects libido. It affects mood. It affects energy. And in some men, it contributes meaningfully to erectile function. But it is not the primary driver. The primary driver is vascular. Men with clinically normal testosterone levels develop erectile dysfunction. Men with low testosterone maintain adequate function. When testosterone replacement therapy is given to men with ED, whose testosterone is genuinely low, it improves libido and energy reliably, but it does not reliably restore full erectile function if the underlying endothelial mechanism is compromised. Because testosterone doesn't fix the pipes, it adjusts the signal that says you want to use them. The pipes themselves, the endothelial function, the nitric oxide production, the vasodilation capacity, those are a separate system, and treating one without addressing the other leaves half the picture unaddressed. The second belief. If it still works sometimes, the problem isn't serious yet. I hear this constantly. It's just stress. It happens to everyone occasionally. I'm not at the point where I need to do anything about it. And look, I get it. I understand the appeal of that reasoning. It's much easier to live with than the alternative. But here's what inconsistent function actually represents clinically. An erection that is present, but less firm than it was 3 years ago. Reliable in the morning, but not reliably later in the day. Achievable with sufficient stimulation, but not maintainable under normal conditions. Present on some nights and absent on others for no clear reason. These are not random fluctuations. They are the functional signature of partial endothelial compromise, vessels that are dilating but not fully. Nitric oxide production that is adequate under optimal conditions, but insufficient when conditions are less than perfect. This is the early stage, not the late stage, the early stage. And the early stage is exactly when vascular intervention, dietary, behavioral, physiological, has the most leverage. The tissue is still responsive. The dysfunction is partial. The window is open. Waiting until function is completely absent to take the vascular signal seriously is the equivalent of waiting for a check engine light to become smoke before pulling over. The third belief is about medication. PDE5 inhibitors, sildenafil, tadalafil, the medications most men are familiar with, are genuinely effective drugs. They work by inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down the signaling molecule that nitric oxide activates, effectively prolonging and amplifying the vasodilation response that nitric oxide initiates. But here is what they do not do. They do not restore endothelial function. They compensate for its decline by amplifying whatever signal is still present. In a man with moderate endothelial dysfunction, that amplification is enough to produce reliable function. In a man with severe dysfunction, the signal is too weak even for amplification to fully compensate, which is why medication becomes less effective over time in some men, not because the medication stopped working, but because the underlying dysfunction it was compensating for continued to progress. The medication manages the symptom. The vascular process continues underneath it. Again, this is not an argument against medication. For many men, medication is the right primary tool, and there is no shame in that. But the belief that medication solves the problem rather than manages the signal while the problem continues leads men to stop paying attention to the vascular inputs that actually determine the trajectory of their function over the next decade. The fourth belief. Diet affects erectile function primarily through weight. Lose weight, function improves. Gain weight, function declines. That's the conventional framing, and it's not wrong. Excess body weight, particularly visceral fat, increases systemic inflammation and contributes to endothelial dysfunction through multiple pathways. But it is incomplete in a way that matters. Specific dietary components have direct effects on endothelial function that are independent of body weight entirely. Dietary nitrates found in dark leafy greens, beets, arugula, spinach, provide a substrate for nitric oxide synthesis through a pathway that bypasses the endothelium itself. In the mouth and the gut, bacteria convert dietary nitrate to nitrite, which is then converted to nitric oxide in tissues, including erectile tissue, through a pathway that does not require healthy endothelial cells to initiate. This is not a minor finding. It is a direct, measurable, mechanism-based pathway for increasing nitric oxide availability in a man whose endothelial production of it is declining. Flavonoids found in blueberries, strawberries, dark chocolate, citrus improve endothelial responsiveness through antioxidant and anti-inflammatory mechanisms that have been studied in controlled trials, specifically in older men. A lean man eating a diet with none of these compounds can have significantly worse endothelial function than a slightly overweight man whose diet is rich in them. Weight matters. Food composition matters more specifically than weight. The fifth belief is the one that does the most damage, not because it's the most wrong, because it's the most seductive. It goes like this: erectile dysfunction after 60 is inevitable. It's what happens. The body ages, systems decline, and at some point you accept the new normal. You've had a good run. This is just where things go from here. I hear this from men who are 58. I hear it from men who are 64. I hear it most from men who were told some version of it by someone in a position of authority, a physician who was moving through a full schedule, a friend who normalized it because he was experiencing it too, a cultural silence that treats male sexual decline as something too uncomfortable to examine honestly. And I'll be direct with you. I've repeated milder versions of that belief to patients myself. Not in those exact words, but in the softened way a busy clinic sometimes communicates what feels like an uncomfortable inevitability. It took the population data to break that habit in me, and I wanted to break it in you too. Longitudinal studies following men across decades consistently show a meaningful subgroup of men in their 60s and 70s with fully preserved erectile function. No medication, no intervention, just function that remained intact while the majority around them lost it. These men are not genetic anomalies. When you look at what they share, their vascular markers, their sleep architecture, the composition of their evening meals, their body composition, and specifically their muscle mass, patterns emerge. Identifiable patterns. Patterns with names and mechanisms and inputs that can be influenced. It's just aging applied to erectile function carries the same cost it carries when applied to fasting glucose creeping toward 100, or blood pressure quietly climbing year over year. It removes agency at exactly the moment when agency has the most leverage. The biology shifts, that part is true, but the rate at which it shifts and how far it goes is not written in stone. The sixth belief is about sleep. Most men do not think of sleep as having anything to do with erectile function. Sleep is rest. It is recovery. It is separate from sexual health in the way that most things feel separate until you understand the mechanism connecting them. Here is the mechanism. During REM sleep, the stage characterized by rapid eye movement and vivid dreaming, the body produces spontaneous erections. Not in response to sexual stimulation, not driven by conscious thought, automatically as a physiological maintenance function. These nocturnal erections serve a purpose that has nothing to do with sex. They deliver oxygenated blood to the smooth muscle cells of erectile tissue, the corpus cavernosum, that would otherwise remain in a low oxygen state during hours of inactivity. Erectile tissue, like all tissue, requires regular oxygenation to maintain its structural integrity. The smooth muscle cells need that blood flow to remain elastic, functional, and responsive. Nocturnal erections are the body's built-in maintenance cycle for a system that cannot oxygenate itself passively. When REM sleep is disrupted through sleep apnea, insomnia, alcohol consumption in the evening, or simply the fragmented sleep architecture that becomes more common after 60, the frequency and completeness of nocturnal erections declines. And over time, the smooth muscle in erectile tissue undergoes changes, fibrotic changes. The cells that should remain elastic begin to be replaced, gradually, by fibrous tissue that does not respond to nitric oxide signals the way healthy, smooth muscle does. The tissue loses its capacity for full engorgement. The hydraulic event becomes less complete, not because the signal is absent, but because the tissue receiving the signal has lost some of its ability to respond. This process is silent. It accumulates over months and years, and it is directly connected, mechanistically, not correlatively, to the quality of sleep in this specific decade of life. A man whose fasting glucose is creeping up, whose erectile function is becoming less reliable, and whose sleep has been fragmented for years, is not experiencing three separate problems. He is experiencing three expressions of the same underlying shift, and sleep is the thread connecting all of them that nobody mentions. The seventh belief is about psychological stress. The conventional framing separates these into two categories: psychogenic ED, where the cause is mental or emotional, and organic ED, where the cause is physical, vascular, hormonal, neurological. The distinction is clinically useful. It is also misleading in a way that leads men to dismiss the psychological dimension as somehow less real or less worth addressing. The truth is bidirectional and specific. Chronic psychological stress, the kind that is sustained over months and years, not the acute stress of a single difficult day, elevates cortisol. Cortisol, at chronically elevated levels, suppresses testosterone production through a direct effect on the hypothalamic pituitary axis. It also drives oxidative stress in vascular tissue, which impairs endothelial function through the same pathways we've already covered. The psychological and the physical are not separate systems that occasionally interact. They share machinery, and the loop compounds itself. A man who experiences one episode of erectile failure for any reason, vascular, hormonal, fatigue, alcohol, stress, frequently carries that experience into the next intimate encounter as anticipatory anxiety. That anxiety activates the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic activation causes vasoconstriction, the opposite of the vasodilation that an erection requires. The anxiety physiologically inhibits the mechanism it is anxious about failing. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. I've watched brilliant, disciplined men get caught in this exact loop and not understand why they couldn't think their way out of it, because thinking is the thing making it worse. This is a measurable neuroendocrine loop with direct vascular consequences, and understanding it as a biological process is the first step toward interrupting it. The eighth belief, and I want to spend a moment on this one, is that clean standard labs mean clean vascular health. Standard cardiovascular screening, resting ECG, cholesterol panel, blood pressure measured at rest, basic metabolic panel, does not measure endothelial function. It measures downstream markers. It measures what the vascular system looks like after dysfunction has been present long enough to alter cholesterol ratios, to elevate resting blood pressure, to leave detectable markers in the blood. These tests are valuable. They catch important things, but they catch them late. Endothelial dysfunction can be present for years, sometimes a decade, before it surfaces in standard panels. Flow-mediated dilation testing, which directly measures the ability of an artery to dilate in response to increased blood flow, frequently reveals dysfunction in men whose cholesterol and blood pressure numbers are reassuringly normal. This test is not standard. It is not ordered at annual checkups unless specifically requested, or unless a physician is already thinking about vascular health at a deeper level than the standard panel requires. Which brings me back to what I said at the beginning. Erectile changes are frequently the earliest clinical signal of endothelial compromise that any measurement would catch, if it were being read as a vascular signal rather than a sexual one. The body is not sending random signals. It is sending the earliest available warning through the most sensitive available channel. The penile arteries respond first because they are the smallest, the most sensitive, the first to reflect what is beginning to happen throughout the system. A man who understands this reads his own body differently. He doesn't file the inconsistency away as stress or age or something to manage with a pill. He reads it as information, early information, the kind that, when acted on correctly, changes what the next decade looks like. Now, what can you actually do? This week, not someday. I want to be honest with you about something before I give you these 3 levers. Knowing the mechanism is the easy part. Applying it consistently is where most men, including men who understood everything I just said, fall short. Not because they're lazy, because behavior change is genuinely hard, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. So take what I'm about to say seriously, not as a checklist, but as a direction. The first lever is the one most men never think to pull: dietary nitrates. Not a supplement, not a powder, food. Dark leafy greens, spinach, arugula, kale, beets. These foods are rich in inorganic nitrates that, when you chew them, interact with bacteria in your mouth and begin a conversion process that ends in nitric oxide production in your tissues. Not through the endothelium, through a parallel pathway that bypasses the endothelial machinery entirely. This matters because it means that even in a man whose endothelial nitric oxide production is compromised, whose vascular signaling has already begun to decline, this pathway still works. The substrate arrives through food. The bacteria in the mouth begin the conversion. The body completes it. Nitric oxide reaches the smooth muscle of the vascular walls and erectile tissue through a route that doesn't depend on the damaged mechanism. This is not alternative medicine. This is not a wellness claim without basis. The nitric oxide pathway is documented, mechanistically understood, and specifically relevant to vascular function in older men. Arugula in a salad, beets 2 or 3 times a week, spinach that doesn't require preparation beyond washing, small inputs, direct mechanism, measurable effect over weeks. And yes, I know that telling a 65-year-old man to eat more arugula sounds almost insultingly simple. I know. But simple and easy are not the same thing, and the men who actually do it consistently are the ones who see the results. The second lever is sleep, and specifically, the protection of REM sleep. The single behavioral pattern most commonly destroying REM sleep in men in this age group is alcohol in the evening. Not heavy drinking, not what most people would call a problem. 1 or 2 drinks in the 2 hours before sleep. A glass of wine with dinner that slides into a second glass while watching something before bed. I'll tell you directly, this one is hard. I've had this conversation with patients who looked at me like I was asking them to give up something they'd earned. And maybe they had. But the mechanism doesn't negotiate. Alcohol suppresses REM sleep with a precision that most people find genuinely surprising when they see the data. It induces sleep faster, which feels like a benefit, while simultaneously reducing the proportion of REM in the sleep cycle. The first half of the night is often reasonably intact. The second half, when REM sleep should be dominating, is fragmented and shallow. The nocturnal erections that should be occurring during those REM cycles, delivering oxygenated blood to erectile tissue, maintaining the elasticity and responsiveness of smooth muscle, are reduced in frequency and completeness. Night after night, month after month. The cumulative effect on erectile tissue is the one I described earlier. Fibrotic changes. Loss of elasticity, a tissue that becomes progressively less responsive to the nitric oxide signal, not because the signal is absent, but because the tissue receiving it has changed. Removing evening alcohol, or moving it earlier in the day, away from the sleep window, is one of the highest leverage behavioral changes available for REM sleep protection in this age group. Not because of some general wellness principle, because of a specific mechanistic chain that connects the timing of alcohol consumption to the oxygenation of erectile tissue during the night that follows. We've covered a great deal of ground today. The endothelial mechanism, the nocturnal maintenance function, the 8 beliefs that cost men years of function they didn't have to lose, the specific dietary and behavioral levers that connect directly to the vascular system driving all of this. But the question underneath all of it hasn't changed. If you are between 60 and 70 and you can still achieve a full, reliable erection without medication, what does that actually mean? It means your endothelium is producing nitric oxide efficiently enough that the hydraulic event your body was designed to perform is still completing itself. It means your vascular system, in at least this most sensitive and early responding channel, is still working with the responsiveness of a younger man's biology. That is not a small thing. That is a vascular report card, and it is one that most men your age cannot produce. But here is the part that matters most. Whether you have that number or you don't, whether your function is fully intact, partially compromised, or somewhere in the early stages of inconsistency that most men file away as stress or age or something to manage quietly. The endothelium is not static, it responds. The tissue that lines your blood vessels is metabolically active. It changes in response to inputs, and it can move in either direction depending on what those inputs are. The man who has full function today can lose it in 3 years if the inputs shift in the wrong direction, and never understand why, because nobody framed it as a vascular conversation. The man who is beginning to lose it today can slow that trajectory significantly, and in some cases, meaningfully reverse it if he understands what is actually driving it and applies the inputs that address the mechanism directly. Tonight, when you turn this off and you're lying in bed, whatever time that is, I want you to do one thing. Don't reach for your phone. Don't open another tab. Just ask yourself honestly, when did I last have a drink within 2 hours of going to sleep? Not to judge yourself, just to notice. Because the nocturnal maintenance cycle we talked about, the REM stage erections that oxygenate your erectile tissue while you sleep, that process is either happening tonight or it isn't. And one of the most common reasons it isn't happening is sitting in a glass on the nightstand. You can't undo last night, but tonight is still in front of you. That's where it starts. Not with a supplement, not with a protocol, with one honest question before you close your eyes. If this is the kind of conversation you've been looking for, honest, mechanistic, without the embarrassment that usually surrounds this subject, subscribe to this channel. Every video we make is built the same way. The real mechanism, the real inputs, no shortcuts, no empty reassurance, no pretending that aging means accepting less than your body is still capable of giving you. 2 seconds, and you'll be here for everything that comes next.